they will now target people below a certain income level, and these people have to show a viable business plan. They have to show their ability to return those loans, the same mechanisms that we have for women in status quo, which means we change the target from women solely to poor women. We think we have a limited resource pool, which means we have to allocate those resources to the people who are most desperate. Right? What is the problem? The problem is, even if targeting women was relevant in the past, it is not relevant today. Why? Because of the huge population or huge percentage of women who were able to get those loans in the past were increasingly lifted out of poverty, and these women are there increasingly lesser and lesser women left under the poverty line. If you're still targeting women, it means you're directing those money to women who are already lifted out of poverty. For example, they're already near middle class status, or they are already in the middle class, right? What does that mean? It means if the target was relevant in the past, it isn't anymore. What we want to achieve is we want equitable distribution. But any clarification now? No. Let's talk about two things. Let's talk about why gender really isn't the main cause of poverty in these nations. Secondly, let's talk about why equitable distribution makes things better for both men and women. Firstly, gender is not the main cause of poverty. We think that's a common misconception, which is also the premise of giving out microcredits to solely women. No. The misconception is this, that the barrier of entry for women into equitable economic participation is that women are inherently disadvantaged because of their gender. That because women are living in a patriarchal society, it limits their opportunity in doing business and all that. We contend that idea. We will argue to you, right? The main reason that women are stopped from being, like this barrier of entry that stops women from entering into doing their business is solely because of the lack of capital, right? Because if there is an inherent discrimination against women, even if they get loans, they won't be able to do their business anyway. And we think that barrier of entry is solely economical, which means they lack the capital to start up a business, which is why we think the microcredit loan is really a very similar idea of giving out loans to SMEs, right? To give people the ability, to start up their new companies, which means the cause of poverty was never exclusive to women alone. The rationale of helping society and just only women does not make sense, because males are also trapped in poverty for the same reasons. In our pursuit to empower women, we forget that a huge amount of population who are poor men, because they are poor, they are also suffering from the same discrimination, also suffering from a lack of education, also suffering from a lack of good nutrition. If we are looking about fair and equality, we really have to empower both genders. Closing.
Don't you think that women are systematically blocked out from things like inheritance and having ownership over capital, which means they have less access to the regular loans that you want to give them to, but men don't have the same problem?
Inheritance, poor people don't have inheritance for them to inherit, right? So the problem of not having inheritance or access to other loans because they don't have capital to prove to the bank is not a problem that is exclusive to female only. If you're a poor man, you still don't have inheritance. If you're a poor man, you still don't have the capital or things to show to the bank that you are able to pay those money back, which is why we think microcredit is very important. Now let's look at why equitable distribution makes things better for both men and women. For two levels. Firstly, we think there are still a lot of women who fall through the cracks, right? Who still are not able to get that microcredit loan anyway, even if it's targeted to women. Who are these women that I'm talking about? Those women who are still, possibly, right, a still small minority of women who are still restricted by family duties. For example, they want to stay at home to take care of their children. For example, their family abilities just don't allow them to go out and work. For example, those women who are not business savvy, who are not able to go out and start up their business even if they have the capital. A lot of women in Bangladesh and India, right, still depend on the men in their family to provide for the economy. If you give out loans to these men who are the breadwinners who will take care of these women, it is better in an economic sense because you empower the entire family, not only the men, but also women. I'll take opening.
How do you help to break this dependency by giving the bargaining chip to both the men who already have an advantage and women?
No. If both men and women can have the loan, means women who are dependent on men can still go out there, right? If they want to, they can still go out there and get those loans. But you cannot neglect those people who might, like by law, are able to have those loans, but they're just tied down by family duties, or they're tied down by their lack of ability to run a business, because not every woman is business savvy. And our proposal seeks to help those group of women who are inherently dependent on men, to empower those men that they can take care of their wives and daughters. Now, on the second level, we think we also have to talk about social ills, right? The trend is this, that I've already told you, and more and more women are moving into the middle class, right? When less and more percentage of the poverty, people under the poverty line are men, it is bad, right? When men are still left out of education and economic participation, that entails that there is a lack of education in trying to teach our men how to respect women, how to teach them that rape is not something that you should do, to teach them things like family planning, to teach them to not do things like theft and robbery, which these men will be forced into if they are still under the poverty line. Which means, on the whole, our society is still not safe. Even if a lot of women are economically and financially empowered, they are still afraid to walk out on the streets because of the social ills that are so prevalent, because so many people are still living under the poverty line. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.
Yeah, yeah.
Mr. Speaker, this debate is not about including men in the feminist movement, nor is it the generic feminist movement policy debate, right? You're talking about a structure that is necessarily prioritizing men and will not give any form of opportunities to women. In these kind of states and in these kind of societies, how do you then best immobilize these women? How do you then best mobilize these women in order for them to break out of that dependency mode and try to actually fend for themselves? Within my speech, I'll answer three main issues. How we best help improve the lives of women, what happens if these women are ostracized, and why do we, on side opposition, make it better? And lastly, I'll talk about how it changes the dynamic of family, right? The family dynamics. But before that, a few direct responses. Sorry. So, opening government wants you to think that men are already the sole breadwinners of these families, and that is why women need to also, that's why the exclusivity of women needs to go away, right? Because then the form of dependency will stay on, and that is the necessary step. This is annoying. Okay. Side OG thinks that men are already the sole breadwinners, and that therefore they want men to continuously be targeted because they will always be able to have that bargaining chip. We think that's particularly harmful because under your paradigm, women already have lack of education or lack of access to all forms of movement or like certain things that are necessarily free or open to men. But under your paradigm, you will never allow those women to actually break out of that mold. This idea that suddenly gender is not the main cause of these problems is false. We're talking about no collateral. We're talking about loans that already don't have collateral. We're talking about loans that are necessarily free to open to society. Men already have the majority of opportunities to get those loans. We tell you that you have to exclusively target women because women are not given the same opportunity, especially when you're talking about the freedom of movement in societies like India, Bangladesh, right? You're talking about finite resources as well. So when you're talking about the finite amount of resources, we think that's already a problem. We think it's already a problem when men already have the majority of the capacity to borrow these loans, right? But why is it already a disincentive for women to also take up loans under your paradigm? Because more often than not, given the fact that these men already have the means or the jobs or opportunity to get those jobs, they're the ones that are most capable of paying back those loans. So women already have women are further entrenched within that vicious cycle and have no way of opting out, right? More often than not, they have to rely on their husbands and will never be able to find a way to be independent. But let's talk about these patriarchal societies and how necessarily political capacity and economic capacity is limited when it comes to women. Not only is their movement, or when it comes to freedom, is limited, but you're talking about this perception that already is within their minds as well. So they already have that innate disincentive to want to have some form of leverage or some form of independence. Before I move on to my first argument, closing.
Man, tell me why is it fair for you to exclusively target only one gender and block the other gender from getting these microcredit loans, especially since all of them are poor?
Because there is a necessity, because men already have those opportunities under status quo and women do not. When you're talking about breaking out of that mold, if you really want to fix the world, you allow individuals that are already, you don't just give the opportunities to men who already have the advantage, but you also give it to women exclusively because they cannot find that platform elsewhere. So first point, right? How do we best improve the lives of women? We want to give them that startup capital. So you want to, number one, give them the confidence to actually go for those loans. Because I'm going to be talking to you about the perception that is already in their minds, or the forms of influences that their families will inculcate onto them as well. The families will tell them, no, you have to stay at home because you are a woman. Right? So these perceptions are necessary things that they have been brought up with, right? So those kind of psyche, or the natural calculus, already stays with them to begin with. But what kind of like small cap startup businesses do we want to encourage women to do? We want like small businesses, investment, you name it. We want individuals who have the kind of confidence to go into it. Because once, like obviously the most intuitive idea is that once you achieve the pinnacle, they won't have to necessarily get these loans anymore. So that is what we want, right? We're not saying that women should have these loans forever. We're saying you have to prioritize, but in your prioritization, who do you give it to? People who need it, or people who are already advantaged or in a privileged situation to get those kind of capitals, right? We think there's already a need for this opportunity to women because under status quo they don't have the means to even get those opportunities for jobs in order for them to break out of that cycle. But even if they have jobs, right, then the same mentality is further entrenched. That even if you do have the money, pass it on to your husband because he will fend for the family. You do not have to keep the money for yourself, right? Or those kind of ideals that will necessarily be entrenched in patriarchal societies. But they tell women they shouldn't become the breadwinners, right? So why is this exclusively necessary? Because women are already disadvantaged to begin with. You need to give them this platform in order for them not to only break out of that mold, but for them to allow the mindset that they can be independent within these societies and actually fend for themselves. Because men under their paradigm can still do it, right? But number two, what happens if these women are ostracized, and why do we make it better? We think under your paradigm, when women are further ostracized and only men are given the forms of advantages, you're already limiting their access to education or access to amenities or all these other forms of platforms to break out of that stereotype and that mold, right? So it's a further entrenchment, a further circular kind of problem that you force these women into. You make it harder for these women to become independent, and you make it harder for these women to even think of opting out in the future, because individuals within the family or within society will continuously reinforce the stereotype and will continuously make it harder for them to also get for government loans, right, or kind of loans that necessarily beneficial for the whole family, right? This moves on perfectly to my third point. How does this change the dynamics of the family? Because that's not what you do to have a woman that's not constantly dependent on a man. We think it's necessary for you to change the dynamics of the family and give equal bargaining chip to both the male and the female. So if you're talking also about the poor families that you desperately so that you seriously want to help, right? We think it's more of a reason for you to go with our policy, because then men can also incentivize their wives to also look for jobs or incentivize their using those loans, right? We think it's necessary for them to also have a sense of accountability amongst themselves. So it's not just us trying to put women on a pedestal. We want women to show accountability amongst themselves as well once they are given the forms of loans or once they're given their platforms, right? Or this idea of social ills that OG talked about, we can still do that, right? We can still necessarily limit them. What they're doing is not fighting social ills. Like men will continuously have a necessary platform to abuse that bargaining chip. Because we in the side tells you that it's necessary for you to help women and how it's detrimental for you to go with that policy. You need to understand the exclusivity of it. And you need to understand what we on side OO actually help women better.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker, before I move on to my positive material on how the systematic discrimination of men in terms of giving this society in more pernicious ways, I have 4 rebuttals today. The first idea that side opening opposition want to bring is that men already have opportunities. They totally miss the crux of this debate because the target that we are targeting today are poor men and poor teenage boys, which no bank will ever lend them because they simply do not have the capacity and assets to show that they will return back any loans whatsoever, that the banks simply do not trust them in the end of the day. That is why, from my Prime Minister onwards, we challenge the reconception that essentially it's not a case about gender, it's a case about a lack of opportunity. It's a case about you being in the lower socio-economic strata of society, that despite whatever gender you are still disadvantaged and still pushed further and denied that kind of opportunity. That is why we need to help every kind of people, that kind of poverty level, regardless of gender. The second contention I want to tell is this: women lack access to capital. That is why you need to give them microcredit loans. For poor women, sure, it is true, but they will still be protected under our model because these poor women will fall under the qualifier that they are being poor and they will given loans. But for middle and upper class women, they do not have a disadvantage when it comes to capital at the end of the day because they can show that they have the ability to return back capital. They can convince HSBC and that they have to return back the loan because they come from the middle and upper class of society. And these companies and banks need to comply with international standards. Banks at HSBC and OCBC don't discriminate against women because they have an international presence, because they need to fulfill certain human rights standards that they are under scrutiny all over the world. So there's no reason that these banks are systematically discriminating against women in the end of the day. We are willing to trade off giving help to these women if it means more poor men and teenage boys are able to get these loans and lift themselves out of poverty. That is the entire crux of the debate, which have entirely missed on side opening opposition. I'll take one from closely. But thirdly, they say that patriarchal structure exists, but they have never really explained what kind of barriers of entry does women have to go into the working field. Because if they really do, even if the microcredit loans is worth millions of dollars, women still will not be able to thrive because there's a systemic discrimination. But in Bangladesh and India, you see women thriving, even though they get only $5,000 a month, for example. That shows that people can access to basic rights. They do not have to face that kind of systemic discrimination they're talking about. Access to education is already available throughout Bangladesh and India. I think it's a mischaracterization on their side of the house. Before I move on, let's take one from Viv.
Most poor individuals are involved in low-skill jobs like hard labor. Given your context where both men and women have absolutely no capital and completely equal, who has more ability to access jobs like those?
We think that if they are poor, both men and women, they can still get microcredit loans, access to sell from the labor and life jobs essentially. The trade-off here are those middle and upper class women who need not get these microcredit loans. Let's look at another I want to talk about. They said that social norms force women to stay at home. Firstly, we think that even if that is true, even if you give them microcredit loans, the husband will still force them to stay at home. So under your model, even though you give them microcredit loans, they would still never be able to actualize in the end of the day. But we say that this is not true because in Bangladesh, we have seen that these women gaining microcredit loans are able to venture out of their own, they're able to break themselves out of these patriarchal structures. We think that they are the ones who are getting disadvantaged in the end of the day. Fourthly, they want to talk about the idea that women will be dependent on men now when you give microcredit loans primarily to men in the end of the day. We say that even if microcredit loans are given to them, they will still, under your model, they will still eventually give men the kind of money and any kind of profits under your model, even if microcredit loans are given to women. That means it's a mischaracterization. We don't think that women will be dependent on men now. We think that the poor men are the ones who are being targeted today, that they are being neglected today, which have never really been talked about. We don't think they have also engaged in the idea of Prime Minister that feminism always strives principally to help the lowest common denominator of society. Now that women are already in a position of comfort, like we are seeing in Bangladesh, that are able to show confidence, they're able to venture into the business field, it's time to let go of some women in order for some men who are disadvantaged to gain up the socio-economic ladder. We also say that economic participation is good in the business sense. Let's look at my positive material. how systemic discrimination of men in giving microcredit loans disadvantages women. 3 levels. Firstly, poor men who are denied of microcredit loans will continue to be in the abyss of poverty and the lack of opportunity. They will often turn to things like violence and crime as an outlet for this kind of their dissatisfaction in society, or they simply want to gain a quick buck. For example, robbery. And robbery often targets the most lowest common denominator of society, which are often women on the streets, which are often children, which are often your grandmothers essentially. So women are the ones who are disadvantaged if you allow men, if you are neglecting men is necessary. We also say on the second level, you create an internal vendetta inside men against women because they now feel dissatisfied. Because the very reason now that they are denied a loan is because they, the women, are the one who took our opportunity away to self-actualize by virtue of them being women. Essentially, you create a natural hatred and dissatisfaction, which will gravitate eventually to the gender, which is taking away opportunity, i.e. the women. It reinforces the patriarchy by terms of hatred in many small and micro ways. It might not be immediate, but I was saying that that kind of dissatisfaction and hatred will burn in your heart as a man. What does this mean? It means that men now will most probably not will be willing to support these businesses by women eventually. And secondly, they'll discourage their family members, which are women, to join this kind of microcredit loans because they want to keep their ego intact, because they don't want to feel that women are able to venture out and I'm a useless person in society. And thirdly, on the third level, you need to also recognize that family members of men, which are women, will end up neglected if you do not give men these microcredit loans. Recognize that not all families have wives who intend to join businesses or venture into microcredit loans. It's a shame when the man who can provide that kind of venture, uninterested wife, is unable to prove his ability and to gain money and to improve the livelihood of the wife and also the daughters by virtue of him being a man. We think that they have a strong structure in society. We think men have responsibilities to take care of women and daughters, which are also the family's targets in society, which should be improved. If you deny men the opportunity, you're also denying wives and daughters who do not intend to venture into microcredit loans. For all those reasons, I think feminism is better championed if you allow an equitable target in society. Thank you.
As against the opening half and against the opening opposition, I might be definitely opposition. Yeah.
Within the case of opening government runs on a false premise that men are left with nothing. But we have to talk about the situation in which, when it comes to these countries, men not only have job opportunities, but already get family welfare, already get job training. These forms of advantages already exist even for poor men. Why give them more when they are already at a structural advantage? In my speech, I'll talk about 3 major issues. Firstly, is gender the main contribution towards discrimination that happens within these societies? Secondly, are they really equity and equitable distribution? And third, protecting women, in which I'll engage directly with this idea of tension and hatred that happens intergender. But before I move on to these 3 issues, I think a few clarification needs to be made. Firstly, this idea of a feminist movement needs to protect, in principle, everyone. But we think that when it comes to structural disadvantages, the feminist movements have to make a priority when it comes to poor women individuals who do not have the same opportunities as men. So this principle is actually value neutral at best. But on a second level, they said that, look, by social ills, guys, I mean, now they're poor, these people will go kill and rob and all of these things that happen, right? We think that all of these things can be still solved in this current welfare system. This debate is about the specific microcredit loans and why those loans are the best way in order for you to solve problems like social ills. We don't think this argument is that relevant in this debate. I'll integrate all of my rebuttals in my 3 major questions. Let's talk about firstly, is gender really the main contribution the discrimination happens within societies, in which I'll recharacterize what exactly we mean by patriarchal societies under our side. Because they say that, look, but women already have equal access to education in Bangladesh. We told you it doesn't matter as much, especially to poor individuals who don't get the best form of educations and not the same form of social environment that men have access to, for example, or the same form of access to skilled labor in which men within patriarchal societies can utilize and exploit, something that women don't have the same opportunity of when it comes to these particular matters. Secondly, we say that gender is the main contribution towards discrimination because they conceded that men expect women to be housewives, to be people who stay at home, and that's because they're a woman, not just because they're poor. So we conceded with this analysis. I don't think they inherently solve this, and like in their case, like at all, sit down, right? But basically, we think that the reason why gender is the main contribution is because the access to political capital and the ability for you to meet conservative politicians and talk about your policies is affected by the fact that you are of a certain gender. Men who are poor can still climb up that ladder because of the sort of welfare that they can stand upon, and that welfare is something that's attributed towards men anyway because they are the breadwinners of the family and they are the ones who are expected to distribute this towards other women, right? They are better in climbing out of that economic ladder per se. But when we give them the microcredit loans, we don't think there's the same amount of accountability as opposed to welfare, right? Because when you talk about welfare, there's a societal position of duty because this is based upon the people's taxation, right? But when you talk about microcredit loans, in which these are given out basically for free because there are no collaterals, very low interest rates, we don't think the same opportunity should be given to men who already have a ladder and a platform to stand upon, right? And this is different from other forms of welfare. That's why we inherently disagree when it comes to you ignoring this gender aspect of this debate. Sit down, right? Secondly, let's talk about, is this really equitable distribution? Because he said that, look, the reason why we want this to happen is because we want this to be given equally to both men and women. Let's talk about competition and how it happens necessarily within our paradigm, right? We told you, when only women are given these particular loans, that means in certain communities, they'll be the only ones who are able to open up businesses, as opposed to having to compete with other men who already have enough capacity to open up these businesses anyway. This is why on the other side, they are better off climbing that particular economic ladder because they don't have to compete with people who are already structurally advantageous than them, right? This competition already is enough in order to give them some form of political capital from the very start, especially when you talk about these women's ability to enter into this job market and the investment market. Especially when in status quo, they don't have the confidence to enter because they have to compete with men who have always had more education, who are stronger, and who society already perceives them as better people when it comes to this particular example, right? On the second level, we talk about equitable distribution better. Sit down, I'll take you guys on at 5:30 or something. It's because, look, in status quo, when you talk about men, right, they say that, look, but men will hoard these resources anyway, and that's why it's necessarily harmful. But what we do under our side is, if only women cannot take these loans, that means if men are pushed into a desperate corner, they will ask their wives and mothers and aunts to go and borrow these loans for them. That means it will be these women who have that form of, some form of freedom to come out, sign that check for themselves, and later on, that will be imposed upon them in order to pay that loan back, which makes them, by default, the breadwinner of the family. And this is especially true if these men don't think that welfare is enough and they are pushed into a corner. We want to create an environment in which some situations men can depend upon women because it changes the psyche of these individuals. Because we don't think conservative mindsets exist in a vacuum, right? We think when people care more about resources and sustainability, that's when men will change their mindsets because when they are pushed into poverty, they will ask women to go and borrow these loans. These form of incentives and bargainingship don't exist under your paradigm because men can go out themselves and take these loans but on their own, right? Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Can you explain why the world is so weird? Men get free money, but women have to pay up the loans later on. How is it fair?
Women get free money as well when it comes to this paradigm, right? But when it comes to situations of conservative families, of these men hoarding these particular resources, they should have this particular accountability, right? This is when we talk about the third level and how we best protect women and how we reduce tension. This is me very answering this question, right? Because we think that one of the major problems of women fighting for their rights is that, but these women will use this money for everything else but jobs, but resources. That's why when you give loans, you encourage accountability and responsibility upon these women and show their ability to prove themselves without having to compete with a structural advantage, right? We think this also allows the ostracized women to get more capital, to be more protected. Because now even if they are ostracized from the family, at least they have some form of loans of which you don't have to compete with the finite resources of the banks in order to give loans, because they have to give loans to men as well. When they are ostracized, they'll have more of this money to themselves and are able to cater to their own independence, right? We think the reason why loans have to be the priority when it comes to giving this to women is because of two things. Firstly, because we want to create a sense of responsibility. We want the fact that in order for you to get this free money, you need to do something with it, i.e. start up businesses and climb up the economic ladder, as opposed to getting $3 of money, right? Because we think men already have this particular advantage to start up businesses. So why give them more of these free loans in addition to their idea of welfare? This debate cannot operate in a generic spectrum of should we give them welfare or not based upon gender. This is about microcredit loans and enforcing accountability. This is about pushing men into a corner to know that women can be responsible as well, to pass this responsibility on your next of kin when it comes to women. This is also about changing family dynamics, as we told by our first speaker. Now these people now will have control over how this is distributed towards their children, towards conservative families, because now women are the ones with the loans when it comes to the most desperate of situations. Because we've shown you the exclusive benefit of only giving this to women, because we don't think it should enter into a market of unfair competition of where men already dominate. That's why I'm proud to be opening opposition.
Can you guys hear me? In a world where men get free money through welfare and women have to undergo microcredit loans that they have to pay back later on, and Zim assumes that this paradigm will create fair competition. And this is why we believe it's already troublesome, and it creates a double-edged sword where it creates discrimination within the system of distribution of money. Because you tell women that if you borrow money from us, you have to pay back, but a man doesn't. But at the same time, giving them a facade of empowerment. And that's why we believe their entire policy is extremely wrong. But before I move on to my argumentation, I think I need to recharacterize everything because OG didn't do it. Number one, first of all, we must understand that women in this particular country are already allowed to work. They work in plantation, they even work in construction site, something that men already work in, which means job opportunity is not limited towards them. So this debate is transformed into a paradigm. Should we allow them to be the employer rather than should we allow them to be the boss, or should we allow them to be the boss or something like that? But another one thing that they fail to underline, or both opening houses fail to underline, is how does this structural change will break down the strong patriarchal value that is already within this particular society. Look at this. When you go to countries like India and Bangladesh, where where microcredit is rampant, you are set to the value of respecting your husband. What happens if you don't respect your husband? This is something that will happen. Number one, you're threatened with a divorce. When a man holds the tali, all women panic in this kind of country, and it's prevalent, especially the poor people. Number two, your wife gets beaten up all the time, and she believes it's the right of the husband. And number three, the wife can be starved, and the wife will be perfectly fine because they think the husband is justified in doing so. So these are the strong entrenchment of patriarchal value that is stuck within this particular society, and how their policy will make it worse. I'm going to integrate my rebuttals into my argumentation. First argumentation, what happens when you exclusively target women? Number one, as what OG have said, there will be an existence of this strong sense of hatred. But I'm going to explain even further, what does this exactly do? Number one, men will live in a cycle that they think that you are unable to provide any more for the family. Think about this. Everyone is poor. You are unable to gain microcredit loans in order for you to start up a business. Therefore, you might not get a job. That's why you're so desperate after a point, you might have to look for a loan. But at this paradigm, you are unable to work. You have to stay at home and you live in this particular household. But what will happen worse under their paradigm? The comparison is the wife can work, the wife gets money. It leaves men in a dilemma. Like, I am in a strong patriarchal society. How do I remain in control of my household? A few things will happen. Number one, I'll remain and I'll exert more forceful control over the economic decision of the family. I'll evaluate and I'll judge as a man. Where does this money have to go? And can you use it for your expenditure of your business? Or should you use it for my pleasure? Or should you use it for my will? And even the woman most of the time have to bow down to the idea of this man, since they are in a patriarchal society and they are unwilling to go and clash against any societal norm. Because men will be further strengthened, because since they're poor, they'll be extremely uneducated and unwilling to change their norms of how patriarchal mindsets work. And this is why we think it's extremely bad. On the next level, unequal chance means men will be at extreme shape. It means since they're not working, they live in a parasitic relationship, which means they now think that I can live comfortably and tell my wife to work. I can absorb everything because my wife is under my control. Since everyone in society believe in this particular patriarchal mindset, we think it's extremely worse. You overconsume the wife's money, you prevent her from enjoying all form of this money because everyone is stuck in this vicious cycle. Before I move on to my second argumentation, why poverty in general is the creator of evil, I'll take one from closing.
The context that opening government set in this debate is that the worst slums of countries like India and Pakistan, there's already rape on the streets and extreme patriarchal structures. Can you tell us how much worse can it get than already it is in status quo?
I'm going to explain why exactly it will be worse. On the first level, why this will place a bigger burden on women? We believe that this wouldn't look like a shift of responsibility, but it will look as a paradigm of adding more burden to the woman. What do I mean by this? Since the patriarchal mindset is still stuck within this particular society, now the woman does not only have to work when they get this microcredit loan, but they also have to take care of their family. There's no shift of responsibility at all because the men will remain stuck and remain to get fight all together. And now it will be far worse for the woman when they will be seen as two things. Number one, they will be seen as an economic tool, a tool that man uses at their pleasure in order for monetary gain to be consumed at the end of the day by the man. The woman will be at a great psychological depression because you will now be seen as I'm not only a tool within the household, but I'm also a tool outside our household being used to generate money for the family. Since the husband could not even get a job in this particular place in the first place, that's why you want to get a loan in the freaking first place. But on the next level, guys, why will this policy empower bigots? We think that now you will force men to marry, and this is why it's extremely evil. Since the only way you can get a loan now is when you have a woman in your household, you'll force men to go and marry any particular woman just in order for them to be a part of this policy and to enjoy the monetary consequences of this particular thing. But this continuous poverty will also be blamed upon women. When they cannot break out of the cycle of poverty, a few things will happen. They will blame it, saying that you fail to expand your business, or you're not getting a proper income for the family. Work harder, gain more money so that we can get out of this poverty. All the blame will be shifted only for the woman, since they are the only capable economic generator in this particular family. Why is this extremely bad, and why must we expand the microcredit expansion? Number one, you allow men to be exposed to outsiders, which means outsiders means you are exposed to external values which are non-patriarchy in nature. You allow the conversation happening between them and other businessmen, and therefore you expose them to this ulterior world. On the second level, you cover greater area. You balance dynamic of discussion, which means more people who are in the business arena will be more exposed to non-patriarchal values. But what happens in their paradigm in comparison? Only women are exposed to non-patriarchal value, which means only them. The poor men will still be stuck and will still try to impose that norm upon their wife. You are creating a vicious cycle where you push a man to a corner, you put them in a zone where they have to react aggressively in order for them to have some form of control over their pride. We don't want that to exist. I beg to propose.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry if you can't hear me. I have a sore throat, and you may not hear me over the deafening screams of my fan club. I brought all of them, all four of them. Ladies and gentlemen, microcredit schemes are fundamentally not just about doling out money to people so that they can start up their own business. Microcredit schemes have an underpinning principle, which is independence. Independence from a patriarchal structure, independence from patriarchal employer, and independence and being able to say no to your husband and being able to leave. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you in my speech two things. Firstly, while the proposal of government entrenches the structural imbalances between men and women and only entrenches the cultural norms of which closing government talked about and disenfranchises women politically. But secondly, I'll also talk about why women have less access to opportunities, ladies and gentlemen, under the side of government. Because in this debate, I think everyone assumes and everyone agrees that if we exclusively give microcredit loans to women, that it will enfranchise women. The debate then becomes, is blocking men out the microcredit loans going to be harmful or not, ladies and gentlemen? But before I go on to my extensions, first, a few things. Firstly, is you're going to force men to marry. I'm not going to rebut this because my girlfriend will be watching, and obviously this is not a bad thing, right? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, this argument is underpinned by one premise, which is men will have no opportunity whatsoever once they don't have microcredit loans. I think we've given you sufficient reason to believe that there are massive amounts of opportunities that men can have access to. How so, ladies and gentlemen? At several levels. Number one, even the poorest of individuals have inheritance, for example, family heirlooms, or even the family farm, ladies and gentlemen, when you're talking about the poorest communities in this regard. But secondly, even if we're talking about the equal across the board, no one has any sort of capital whatsoever, men are more able to access things like hard labor, things like employment, ladies and gentlemen, that are predominantly the employment that is accessible to the poor. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, given a situation where both men and women are employed, men have more access to legal recourse in comparison to women. For example, in these countries like India and Pakistan, when women are fired, women have less access to the courts and be able to say it was wrongful termination of a contract, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore women have less access to the kind of help that you need. That means, on a balance, ladies and gentlemen, men don't need the help that you're talking about, and men have the opportunities to be able to be financially independent, ladies and gentlemen. That means the argument of closing government, where you will now shift the blame to women and be able to say that they are the ones that are the sole economic factors, therefore, why didn't you run your business better, does not function because men have the ability to have economic access as well, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, we will posit to you, even if you shift the blame to women, why is that a bad thing comparatively to status quo, where they are considered absolutely useless? At the very least, if you shift the blame to women, there is a degree of dependency between men and women, ladies and gentlemen, that will shift the dynamics between how men view women as independent economic actors. Reading opening opposition clarified this sufficiently enough. But I'm going to engage the rest of the extension of closing government in my extension, but before that, I'll give opening a shot.
The poor are not dependent only on hard labor. There are a lot of poor women who survive on sewing, cooking, cleaning, babysitting. How are job opportunities less accessible to women than to men?
Because you don't have legal recourse once you get fired. Because the skills that you can have are things that are meanly paid. Because your economic mobility, ladies and gentlemen, is dependent on how well you can entrench yourself in the same stereotypical roles like cleaning, cooking, and everything that they're talking about. Those things are exceptionally harmful, ladies and gentlemen. So let's talk about how you will entrench the cultural norms that you're talking about on this side of the house. First, I think we need to point out that the characterization of government have been extremely convenient whenever they want to argue things. First, on opening government, you have a burgeoning middle income, therefore women don't actually need exclusive protection. But suddenly down the line, we get this very extreme characterization where women are being raped on the street and women are being oppressed down the line, ladies and gentlemen. That's why men need to be helped as well. We think they need to pick one. But secondly, we think, and we will posit to this house, when you place men and women in the same pool of people to be considered for microcredit loans, it is more likely than not that men will always get the loan and women will not, ladies and gentlemen. Why so? Because it is more likely that banks will think that men are a safer investment in comparison to women because they own things like farms, because they own things like livestock, because they are able to access opportunities and the workplace a lot easier in comparison to women. So when you're placed in a situation where a man and a woman is equally as poor, ladies and gentlemen, have equally as good ideas, it is more likely that banks will give the man over the woman because it's a safer investment to give the man. You entrench that patriarchy, ladies and gentlemen. But thirdly, the argument on government is they assume that empowering men will make them more moderate and make them more amenable to feminist rights. We don't think so. We think it's a gamble. As much as we see countries like Malaysia moderating where we have economic development, we have as many countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar who are deeply entrenched in cultural norms, even though have massive economic development in Asia. That means what changes your cultural sensibilities isn't economic development, but it's based on who controls that economic development. And if in this instance, men have access to economic development more, that means the patriarchal structures they're talking about are further entrenched and further validated under this side of the house. You don't create moderation. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to create political enfranchisement, you need to create political enfranchisement by making an economic enfranchisement the prerequisite, ladies and gentlemen. Why so? Because men are less likely to fight for women's rights when they become economically enfranchised, because they know that their patriarchal structures have been validated by the fact that they have become rich, ladies and gentlemen. That means that I have become rich by oppressing women. I am becoming rich without women within my economic sphere. Why should I help women now that I'm already middle income or rich in this instance? That means men, if they are politically enfranchised, they are less likely to help women on this side of the house. That means, in conclusion, the only context that you live in and the world that you live in on government is the entrenchment and the exclusivity of men, even when you open it up to both genders on this side of the house. That's why they need to be exclusively offered to women in this instance. Ladies and gentlemen, the point of microcredit schemes isn't just to give someone money or let them start a business. It's about women being able to start up their own business, being independent from the patriarchal structure, being independent from your husbands, being independent from employers that are patriarchal as well. Closing opposition is exceedingly proud to oppose.
Tessie? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that when we have a finite pool of resource, we should give a hand to the one who needs it the most, chosen from a pool of people who's suffering from poverty, regardless of them being men or women. This is the best way as to how we would help them to get out of their poverty line, and that includes women as well. We think that it's despicable coming from side CEO by saying that the only goal that they have is to empower the women, being submissive to the fact that, and they did not give us like any ways as to how they plan to break the patriarchal mentality, right? Therefore, we think that what they're doing is they're only putting the woman in a worse situation, how the woman will suffer more under a patriarchal system. That's the unique extension coming from side CG, which I will elaborate more within my speech. Within my speech, I have two questions to be answered. Firstly, how do we best protect the women? And secondly, what's the best option for us to counter the narrative of the bigots when it comes to the role of women? First, who best protect the women? Coming from side CG, we think that when you exclusively target the woman, it will be very harmful for the women. Because why? Because you have to understand that being under the poverty line, it will bring out the worst in individual. And in this instance, we're talking about the husband or the male dominance within the family. Right? When you only focus on the woman, when you only focus on giving financial help to the woman, you only give the financial capability to the woman. Therefore, the men in this very entrenched patriarchal system will think that they need to exert more control over the family, right? When now you only empower the woman, and the men having less control over the family. Therefore, we think that under their paradigm, the men will feel that they have to resort to a more radical option to further control the family. That's why we think that it's more harmful for the women. And we also think that because of this mentality is hereditary in nature, we think that the whole bench of side opposition failed to prove as to why the mentality of these people in the patriarchal system will suddenly change when you give the financial capability to the women, right? Therefore, the question remains: how do you best help the women to survive under this patriarchal system? We think that when you only empower women financially, you exert unfair burden to this woman. When you make this woman the sole breadwinner within the family, you are in a way forcing this woman to work for the family, right? Now they have more role to fulfill, not just being a mother, a wife, taking care of the household. Now you're forcing them to also maintain the family financially, which is really not the focus under status quo. Therefore, we think that you give an unnecessary pressure to the woman even more. But before that,
in status quo, both men and women already receive some form of welfare. Why give more of an advantage to the party, i.e. men, who can already climb the economic ladder and already have a benefit over women?
We think that it's false coming from side opposition to assume that men having absolute access to welfare and job opportunities, right? Because you have to understand, when it comes to people living under the poverty line, it means that regardless of you being man or woman, because of the fact that you're poor, meaning that you have less or no access to education at all. Therefore, we think that the type of job that is available for this kind of people is the same regardless of you being man or woman, right? And we also think that the opportunity of them to get loans is equal as well, because you have to understand that when it comes to men asking for loan and the fact that this man is poor to begin with, they don't have any more to offer in comparison to the women. They have the same thing, right? Therefore, we think that the opportunity should be equal for both men and women, due to the fact that the accessibility to this kind of wealth and opportunities is the same because of the fact that they are poor. Going to my next issue, what's the best option to counter the narrative of bigots when it comes to the role of women, right? We think that side opposition is just providing a facade, providing independence for this woman. How? Because firstly, we think that the mentality is already entrenched to begin with, and we think that when they try to say that they wanted to change the dynamic of the family, right? They want the men to depend on the women instead. We think that sort of dependency is toxic
to begin with. Because now, because of the patriarchal system, the woman will be seen as an economic tool, meaning the man can now take advantage of the woman, right? And adding the control to the of the man to the woman even more in comparison to status quo. And we also think that the woman we also think that under our paradigm, the man, in order for you to change the man's mentality, right, you have to give the man an equal chance financially. Because now, when the man is able to climb up the social ladder, they can have more access to become moderate, right? Now they have more exposure to moderate people like the businessmen and people who actually succeed. In comparison to them, right, where the men have no access to get exposure to the outside world of the moderate people, now the men will be stuck with their poor friends having the same mentality, right? That's how we think that the patriarchal mentality will be entrenched under their paradigm. And we also think that they will have more incentive to liberalize, right? Because now they will look at their businessmen friends, when they give education to their daughters, when they provide good welfare to their wives. That's how this man will be influenced to prioritize and to give the same opportunity to their daughters and their wives. At the end of the day, we think that CJ will take this will be able to will take this debate because we have extended from whatever the OG have provided, from the mere importance of empowering women. We have told you how we best help and protect the woman and changing the patriarchal mentality within the society. And we also have to analyze the impact of the to the women when you really empower women, reflecting the fact that we have to change the patriarchal mentality to begin with. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, CG definitely take this debate.
If this was an ideal world and we have an infinite amount of resources, obviously we wouldn't finance everyone below the poverty line. But understanding that we have finite resources, we then have to evaluate whether or not, when thrown into poverty, who has it worse, men or women, and who has a better chance of escaping the poverty line, and who do we help in that particular situation. On side of the government, what they aspire to do is help the poor and elevate poverty. Although we agree that's a good value in itself, they were rather silent on the imbalance of power between men and women. And they are also rather silent on the lack of opportunity that women have and the oppression that women suffer, especially when they are under poverty. Right? The only thing their policies have an opinion about when it comes to protecting women is that if we eventually educate men, then men will eventually stop treating women like that. But that's less likely to happen because regardless of education, the basis of power is that men still have that financial advantage and social power that naturally happens under their side. No, thank you. That means the only way we can make a meaningful change is to change that basis of power by giving women financial independence and the ability to be self-sufficient and break that dependency on men. So we think that's the only way any meaningful change can be created. No, thank you. We also think that OG's large chunk of their case were about why we need to solve poverty, and we largely agree is the problem in itself. But we think that there are various other avenues to solve poverty. Microcredit is only one avenue in specific that we want to talk about, and we want to focus on women. No, thank you. So the debate then becomes within people who can't access loans and who are poor, whether or not we should exclusively target women. No, thank you. But in start closing government, we heard something much weirder, which is the inferiority complex that men will eventually have when they lose power and they eventually become more aggressive. We think that the basis of men having power or their ability to control women come from their ability to have financial independence and women's lack of ability to have that financial independence. So it's more likely under our side that women with financial independence, women who have been empowered, are more likely to stand up against their husbands who have all kinds of inferiority complex in the first place. And they're also saying that we're giving women an unfair burden. But we're very happy to have women change the dynamics of their relationship, for them having more power in their relationship, for them from not only being a mother to also being a breadwinner of the family. We're very happy to change that dynamics. We don't think that's necessarily a problem. Another problem they have is that they needed men to be more exposed to non-patriarchal value in the business. We don't think this is a benefit that they can immediately accept, right? Because we think that economic development doesn't necessarily mean that it eliminates patriarchal values. What eliminates patriarchal values is who are in control of that particular economic development. For many years, men have been in control of that economic development. And it hasn't changed or the way patriarchy exists in that current situation. No, thank you. So we don't think that just by exposing men to money or business or their golf buddies will necessarily increase the ability of men to accept more patriarchal values. So thank you. So we think it's also important to acknowledge that side-closing government dismiss entirely the case that came from side-closing opposition. We told you that there's a huge, significant difference between the ability of men and the ability of women to survive in poverty and to survive without money. For example, men who are poor as they can get access to things like inheritance, family house, or as well as hard labor. But for women, most of the jobs, for example, the jobs that she pointed out as well, like babysitting or being a maid, are all of those jobs that women are open to huge amount of abuse as well. Maids are people who are abused the most. So even if there's little access for women to jobs, those access are largely unfavorable and very, very abusive and damaging towards women. So men inherently has it easier to survive without money. So we need to empower women who can't have access. So thank you to that money. So we think if you have a same pool of funds, men will always get ahead of women. Yes, please.
Well, like under status quo, both men and women can already work. And even under this paradigm, men take away money from women. Tell me, how will you break this vicious mindset of a man who often thinks that he's better not because of financial control, but because he's a man?
Well, I don't think that exists in a general scale, right? Men always feel empowered because they have a reason to feel empowered. They will always talk about the social struggle, they will always have more say in the family. If now women are able to control that and have the ability to finance themselves, we don't think it's a reason why women can't feel as empowered. And now if she wants to leave the family, she can, because she's financially viable, reach out to her husband as well. We think that this more of a leverage for the women. We don't understand why they can't understand that simple logic. No, thank you. We also say that women necessarily feel like there's a hostile environment in the workplace, there's little protection for women. So it's very important that we let women be financially independent, especially in the context that Uchi wanted to talk about. In countries like India and Pakistan, where there's an already existing patriarchal structure, we need women to be outside that structure and be financially independent. What we aim to do inside opposing opposition is create political enfranchisement for women through financial enfranchisement, right? So we think that how, like, men, if they are in control of the economy, also in control of most of the finances, have little to no incentive to help women or push for policies that help women. Women who have more ability to have a say have more likelihood of pushing for more protection of women and more welfare for women as well. So we always need to include women in economic development to reverse the patriarchal structure that happens in India, Pakistan, in countries like that. Right? So at the end of the day, what are closing opposition exclusively brought to the debate? We told you that there's a huge difference between the ability of women and men to survive in poverty, and at giving women financial independence from the patriarchal structure as well as from their husbands, give them the ability and a higher leverage, not only in society but within their family as well. We told you that the problem of poverty hits women especially hard compared to men. We see there are a lot of avenues for men to access and for men to escape that particular situation and to survive, but little avenue for women to survive. We're very proud to defend women.